Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first NYU Evaluation Technical Assistance session of 2021. If you're comfortable, please feel free to turn on your video so we can see you, and that'd be great. So my name is Liz Ward, and I'm a senior program assistant with the New York State Health Foundation. And for those of you who have not attended one of these sessions before, every year NYU hosts 2 day-long in-person workshops for all NYS Health grantees, one in January and one in June, focused on topics about evaluation and evaluation technical assistance. Of course, due to COVID-19 last year, we transitioned these in-person workshops into a series of virtual learning sessions that we started in fall 2020. This is the kickoff session for the next series of sessions that we'll be hosting throughout the spring. We'll be following up with more information on the upcoming 3 sessions after this session. And Dr. Carolyn Berry from the Department of Population Health at NYU Langone will be leading the session today. And with that, I'll hand it over to her.
Okay, thanks. So welcome everyone. We are a small group, and if you do feel comfortable, put on your video while we're in group format. I'm going to go to slides in a minute, and then you can go off. But later there's going to be a breakout room exercise. So in your breakout rooms, I would ask that you go on video because you're going to work together as a group. Okay. So without further ado, I will start. Today's session is one of our most basic sessions, and also happens to be one of our most popular ones when we do it in person. We'll see how it goes online. And that's how to use a logic model. And we're going to be focused on how one can use it to develop an evaluation plan for your intervention. But it's also very useful for programmatic purposes as well. We'll talk about that a little bit. Before we get started, how many of you you can, I guess, raise your hand, either physically with your hand if you're on video, or put your little hand thing up. How many of you have been involved in some kind of logic model exercise where you've either done this on your own or as a group for a proposal maybe, or other purposes? Okay, well, actually not many of you. That's less than usual, because doing this has become really very common. And in fact, there are a fair number of funders that either require or strongly encourage having such a thing as part of a proposal. But that's great, since you're relatively naive to the topic. We'll be able to cover a lot of ground. But even Marielle, who has done this before, I think you will still find it useful as a refresher, and maybe somewhat different way to look at it. Okay, so I'm going to hopefully share my screen. And don't hesitate to in any way get my attention if you have questions as we go along. I will occasionally stop and ask for if there are any questions. Okay, so what do we even mean by program theory? Well, this is nothing really mysterious. And I like this first definition from Bickman. Program theory is just a common sense sort of model of how a program, and you can substitute the word program with other terms, intervention, policy, anything like that, how it's supposed to work. And you might think that, oh, we don't really have a theory, but this is not true. Anytime you are developing and implementing a program, an intervention, promoting a policy, you have a working theory in your mind, because a theory is really nothing more than how you think it's going to work. How do the different elements hang together? How do the different activities that you're proposing, how are they supposed to lead to the outcomes? You all have goals for your programs, your interventions. You are trying to change something in the world. You may be trying to improve people's health. You may be trying to get health insurance into people's hands. You may be trying to house the homeless. You may be trying to reduce food insecurity. There may be any number of things you're trying to do, but you're trying to make change. And you have put together some set of activities that you think is going to lead to that change. And that's the theory. Now, what you may not have thought about at all is that there are really two key components to program theory, and they are different from one another. One is the process theory. This is the how. This is, you might also think of this as the operational theory. How is it that you're going to implement this new service? What resources are you going to bring to bear? What do you need that you don't have in place? What are the different steps? How are you going to put them in action? Maybe you need to do some training. Maybe you need to hire some staff. How's that all going to come together? And the kind of end of the process theory are the various immediate deliverables. So if you're developing training materials, then the immediate deliverable is the training materials. If you're supposed to be training people, then the immediate deliverable is how many people got trained. Okay, so that's the process theory. The impact theory is the why. As I said a minute ago, you're not doing all this for the sake of doing it. You're not doing these activities to keep your staff busy. You're doing it because you are trying to make change among your target population, whatever that might be. And the impact theory is why you think that doing this set of activities is going to effect that change. So it's focused on the effects of the intervention. And when we get to our logic model, it's focused on the outcomes and the impacts columns, whereas the process theory is focused on the resources, activities, and outputs. Well, why, if we all have a theory in our minds, and we have some notion of A, how we're going to implement this program, and B, why it's going to get to the outcomes that we're interested in, why do we have to bother with any somewhat formal exercise in program theory? We're going to focus today on how we use program theory in evaluation, but it's really just as important for for developing and implementing programs. You can use program theory as you think about the problem that you're trying to solve and how you're going to address that problem. So program development. What set of strategies are we going to do to decrease food insecurity, to get people vaccinated for COVID? How are we going to put those things together? So thinking through your theory may help you put together the program, and then that may also help you put together a proposal. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes funders require this, but even if they don't require it, having a little program theory diagram can be extremely helpful as you develop a proposal so that you're trying to get money to really help explain to the funding source what you're planning to do and why you're planning to do it and why it matters. And so it can really be effective as part of developing a proposal. A little bit later in the game, once maybe you've already decided on an approach, maybe you even have gotten funding and you're doing it, having an explicit theory can help you fine-tune the program. It can help you zero in on perhaps aspects of the program that aren't working maybe the way you thought they were, and you can make adjustments, fine-tune. Something that I don't think people think about very often, but I have seen this in action, is going through a little exercise in program theory, whether you're just kind of putting it down on paper and passing it around to stakeholders, or you even get stakeholders together and you say, okay, we're going to map out what we think the theory is here. It gets multiple stakeholders on the same page. And I have seen this fairly dramatically. I have gone into organizations and kind of led a program theory exercise where we are trying to create the program theory. And when you go around the room and talk to the different stakeholders and say, well, what do you think the program is? What do you think the goals are? How do you think you get from, X to Y? You will find that however many stakeholders you have in the room, that's how many different ideas there are about this. People tend to not be on the same page, even and it can be subtle differences. But by putting it all down, getting it out of your heads, putting it on paper, you can very effectively and efficiently, I would say, get people on the same page so that we're all operating with the same understanding of what this intervention is and what we think it's going to accomplish and how we think it's going to accomplish those goals. And then a second part, which we're going to spend some time thinking about, is that in addition to diagramming the theory, which is where I think most people focus their energy, a second important part is to uncover the assumptions that underlie the program. All programs make assumptions. And the problem is that these assumptions are typically not stated. But even more than that, you're not even aware you're making assumptions. And by uncovering those assumptions and making them clear to all, you can avoid some problems. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Now, that's sort of on the program side. I'm an evaluator. I do practically nothing but evaluation. Why do I bother? I'm not developing programs. I don't implement programs. What do I care about theory? Well, for me, particularly as an external evaluator, typically, it helps me establish a relationship. So by showing the program people and the staff and various stakeholders that the evaluators understand the program, they get it, this really helps establish a relationship and a certain amount of trust. Okay, we can work with you to evaluate our program because we believe you understand what it is and what we're trying to accomplish here. But beyond that, it really becomes a map, not just for the program, but for the evaluation. If I'm going to be involved in process evaluation, which is all about implementation of a program, reviewing the program theory is going to tell me what I need to look at. What are the outputs that are being proposed? Do those outputs exist? Do they exist in the quantity and the quality that was anticipated? That would all fall under process evaluation. But it zeroes the evaluator in on what to look at. On the outcome side, if you're conducting an outcome evaluation to discover whether a program is effective, then the program theory will help you, again, zero in on what are the outcomes that I should be looking for? What should we be measuring? What are the units of analysis? Is it children? Is it families? Is it schools? Is it organizations? It helps you decide on even the unit of analysis. But really, it helps you identify the evaluation questions. And sort of a second aspect of that is it can help you also think about unintended consequences. Because by looking at the whole theory, you can see, oh, well, this is why we think we're going to make these changes. But now that we understand some of the assumptions and the various activities, we might want to be alert to some potential unintended consequences. And we might want to go so far as to make sure we include those in an evaluation. And then finally, engaging in program theory relates the evaluation and its findings to two important audiences. One, most important, is the program itself. If you are using the map of the program to develop an evaluation, then that evaluation is going to be highly relevant to the program, to the organization, and to the various decision makers involved with it. And of course, that's critical. On the other side, it can also help link the findings of a specific evaluation, and evaluations are always specific. They're focused in on one particular implementation of a program model, let's say. But that may have implications for broader science, for the broader field. So for example, in an example I'm going to share with you later, we were evaluating a program designed to help high-risk homeless families. And at the time we were doing that, homelessness among families was a fairly new phenomenon. It was a phenomenon that really rose in the 80s. Before that, most homeless people, vast majority of homeless people, were singles. And when we did the evaluation, we found that there was such little study of homeless families and what happens to them and how to help them, that there was a lot of interest from the academic kind of world of people who were just getting their arms around the idea of family homelessness. And our evaluation became very much a part of that, a part of understanding the problem, the phenomenon, and potential solutions. Any questions so far? Any comments or thoughts? Okay. So when you think about working with program theory, whether it's for programmatic purposes or for evaluation purposes, there's really two kind of major phases, I'll say. And the first one gets the most attention, and that's the explication of the theory. You know, getting the theory out of people's heads and putting it down on paper, having a diagram of it so everybody can look at it and say, okay, yeah, this is what I thought it was. Nope, this is not exactly what I thought it was, etc. But as I said earlier, another part of that is something that isn't done as often, and that's pulling out these assumptions. And we'll talk about this in a second, but assumptions fall both on the process side of things, but on the impact side of things. So a very common assumption, for example, that people don't, it's so ingrained and part of your thinking, you don't even recognize that it is an assumption, is that with any intervention that is voluntary, and I think many of the interventions that you might be working on are voluntary, you make an assumption that people will want to be in your program, that people will take up the program. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with programs that you have launched, services that actually didn't happen to the degree that you thought it would. This is an assumption, you know, the classic from the Kevin Costner movie, if we build it, they will come, right? That's an assumption, and that may or may not be true. That's a process assumption. On the impact side of things, you have all kinds of assumptions about why doing these particular activities are going to reduce homelessness, reduce drug addiction, reduce food insecurity, etc. The second phase that we kind of embark on a little bit, but can be done even more thoroughly, is where you take this a step further and you try to assess some of these key assumptions, preferably before you launch the program. Because the idea here would be to make sure that these assumptions that we often weren't even aware we are holding in our minds, that they are true. And so the very first step of this is just a sort of common sense, logical assessment. We look at it, we realize, well, yeah, we are assuming that people will have the time and the interest to come and participate in our program, to meet with a case manager, to come to our educational sessions, to show up where we're enrolling people. Well, sometimes just looking at that in a common sense way, maybe thinking a little bit on your prior experience with other programs, other services, you might say, yeah, you know, that isn't as easy. That's not as much of a given as we thought. And so maybe we need to think about that a little bit more. You can take it a little step beyond just common sense and logic, although often that's enough to point out some potentially flawed assumptions. You can take it to experts. When we think of experts, we often think of, you know, clinicians or academic types, and it can be those kind of experts, but experts can also be your own staff who has experience working with members of this target population in other programs. And maybe you talk to them about, hey, do you think this new idea that we have, this new service, this new intervention, you think that this will be appealing, that people will have the time for this? And those can be experts who could give you thoughts on an assumption. You can also, you know, look to the literature. This doesn't have to be as academic as it might sound. So, for example, for many years, a lot of programs and interventions were premised on the just say no philosophy, right? That Nancy Reagan made so popular in the 80s. Just say no to drugs, just say no to sex, just say no, you fill in the blanks. Well, if you're thinking about launching a program, a just say no program, you might want to take a little look-see in the literature. The literature, for example, on the DARE program, which was the prototype of just say no to drugs, for particularly aimed at youth. It was a spectacular failure over and over, and it's well documented. And if your assumption is that a just say no approach is going to work in your case, you can just look in the literature and find out that that's kind of doomed to failure. Sometimes you test some of the assumptions. This could take the form of a pilot, a small demonstration project, often implementing key aspects of the program, maybe under sort of controlled conditions, small scale, ideal conditions even. If the program doesn't work in those conditions, then you can bet it's not going to work scaled up, messier in real world conditions. You can also do other sorts of activities to test assumptions. So if one of your assumptions is that people will want to be involved in this program, that they have time for it, well, maybe you do a little focus group, or you do a quick and dirty survey, and I'm saying survey, that sounds grander than it needs to be, with clients that you have in another program, and say, hey, we're thinking about offering this program. Is this something you'd be interested in? If only 10 or 15% of them say, yeah, I'd be interested in that, you might consider your assumption that people will take up this program to be flawed. Okay, so and then of course, full-scale evaluation can also identify flawed assumptions, both on the process side and on the impact side. And then once you do any of that, you are allowed to go back and change the theory. So this program theory is a working kind of a document. You're going to map out your original ideas about A, how the program should operate, and B, why it's going to achieve the outcomes you think it's going to achieve. And if you do some evaluation or other sorts of assessment of assumptions and find out that you've made some flawed assumptions, you can perhaps attack the assumptions themselves, change those circumstances, or you can go and change the theory so that it doesn't involve that flawed assumption. So now we're going to talk about a particular approach to explicating program theory, and that's the logic model. I think this, I would hazard a guess as to say this is the most common approach. It's the approach I use. There are other approaches. You may have heard terms like theory of change, for example. That's a somewhat different approach to explicating program theory. But the logic model approach, in my mind, is the most straightforward. It's a linear approach. All the arrows move from left to right across the different columns. And it's what I teach. When I teach my graduate students about this, it's always what I present in seminars like this. And it is, in fact, the approach that I use in my work. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that the Kellogg Foundation were really, I would have to say, pioneers in this field, if you will, or this technique of logic modeling. And if you ever want some handy templates, you can go to their website. They have developed a lot of resources for how to do logic modeling. And I present their definition here in homage to them. So here is the most basic framework. And to my mind, this works great. I mean, you can make this somewhat more complicated, and sometimes I do, but these 5 columns are the basic columns. You need to identify the resources. What does it take? What do you need in place to launch this new intervention? What kind of staff? what kind of expertise, what kind of money, space, materials, pool of volunteers, all kinds of things can be in that column. Then the next column is the intervention itself. And a common, I won't say it's a mistake, but I would say a limited approach to the activities column is not being specific and concrete enough. To be really helpful, you want to pull apart your proposed intervention. You want to go back to the very beginning. If you need to hire staff, then hiring staff should be an activity. Recruiting them should be an activity. If you need to train staff, developing training materials might need to be an activity. Doing the actual training of staff is an activity. Okay, all that might precede what you think of as the intervention, but it's part of it. And so the more you can pull apart the activities, the clearer your program emerges, and the clearer the next column becomes, because the next column is the outputs column. And as I said earlier, these are the immediate deliverables. So if you're training people, the output is how many people you train. If you are developing new educational materials, it's the number and the quality of those educational materials. If one of your activities is enrolling people into your program, it's the number of people reached out to, it's the number of people who signed up, enrolled, etc. So every activity in your activity column should link to at least one, and possibly more than one, output. And there shouldn't be any outputs that are not directly linked to an activity. It's a map, okay? It's a map. The first three columns here is the process theory. They represent the process theory, what we need to do the program, what the program is, and those immediate outputs. And then the second two columns are the desired changes. And you know, this is where you might have, sometimes I have a little greater complexity. Sometimes we break out the outcomes column into two columns. We have shorter term outcomes and then longer outcomes. Thinking of this always as a chain. So we go from our activities to our outputs to our most proximal, our most short-term outcomes. And then those short-term outcomes, which might be something like people became more knowledgeable about how to manage their children's asthma. Okay, that's the short-term outcome. We were doing some kind of a program that was specifically designed. The goal is to help parents manage their children's asthma better. So the first outcome is that they should understand more what they need to do and how to do it. Well, then that would lead to a second outcome, a little bit further out outcome, of changing their behavior so that they are more effectively following their child's asthma action plan, or reducing triggers in their homes. Okay, so first we have knowledge change, then we have behavior change. And then impacts are our longer, more lofty goals. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this so that children have better quality, healthier lives, okay? And that families have less stress associated with hauling their children off to the emergency department all the time because of asthma attacks. Those would be the longer term impacts, okay? The difference between outcomes and impacts is important, but it's not critical. The difference between outputs and outcomes, though, is very critical. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on this, because this is a often poorly understood point. And the difference is very important. It's very important because it's the key difference between having a well-implemented program and an effective program, okay? You can have a beautifully implemented program. And by that, I mean all of your outputs line up just like they were supposed to. You were supposed to recruit, hire, and train X number of staff. You did it. You were supposed to get 150 families into this asthma, pediatric asthma program. You got 150. Heck, you got 160. Okay, you even went over your outputs. But the effectiveness is whether the children suffered less from their asthma. Okay, that's an outcome. And if you were focused in an evaluation framework on outputs, that's fine. And that's what we call a process evaluation. But you are only describing ultimately how well you implemented your intervention. Okay. Even though you had 150 families, if not one single child had better asthma outcomes, went to the emergency room less, had fewer days missed from school, if none of that happened, you had a successfully implemented program, but it was ineffective. And it's really important to understand this difference. And so I have a couple of other examples here. So this is a program I evaluated as well. This was a program that was designed to help new mothers, particularly low-income mothers. And in this case, the program was focused on families whose newborn was enrolled in Medicaid, so low-income families, to help them better understand early childhood development, to recognize signs and symptoms of a child not developing well, helping parents understand when they should, what kind of questions they should be asking of their pediatricians or raising issues. And so this particular program, this was a program in multiple states, but in one state, one of the things that they did was they visited all new mothers within 2 weeks of their child being born. And then they visited them for about 6 sessions. And somebody visited them. It was a clinically trained person, sat down, explained to them what their infant should be doing, what they should be looking for, et cetera. Well, the output of that is, how many new mothers received 6 visits, what percentage of them received all 6 visits. You might even think about outputs like the quality of the visit. How much time did the home visitor stay with the family? How many topics were they able to cover? How interactive was the session? All that would be really interesting information about how the program was implemented. But even if even if the mothers were given a little survey to say, how satisfied were you with those visits? How much did you like those visits? That's all outputs, okay? How much they liked the visits, how satisfied they were with the visits, it says something about the appeal of the home visitors, the attractiveness of the program, the trust, perhaps, that mothers had in these visitors. But all of that may be terrific, high, but the outcome here is, did the new mothers get greater knowledge about child development? And even if they loved the home visitors, they loved the company, they loved being visited, they felt, special, got some attention. If they didn't learn anything about child development, then the program was not effective. It was not achieving its first outcome, which was improved knowledge. Of course, it had subsequent outcomes of changes in behavior, and ultimately that more children would be identified early as having developmental problems, more children would get into early intervention services earlier, et cetera. Those are all outcomes. And so I just want you to really kind of think about this with respect to your own programs. There is nothing wrong and everything right with evaluating outputs. We evaluate outputs to make sure we're spending the money properly, to demonstrate to the funder that we are delivering the services, we are getting the numbers of people we said we would, we thought we would. It's evidence to us that our programs are rolling out, in the way we thought. And we want to do that, and we want to evaluate that. But do understand, if that's where your evaluation ends in the output column, then you are not coming to the point of being able to say, and the program worked. You're saying the program was implemented well, but you have to move into outcomes to really be able to talk about the effectiveness of a program. A program can be popular and not be effective. It can be well implemented and not be effective. Okay. And so I really like to sort of hammer home this point of the difference between outputs and outcomes. Any questions about this? Okay. This is, oh yes.
Sorry, I just came off video. I had a question, and maybe you're going to get to this, but my name is Risa Zoll. I'm from Planned Parenthood. I was wondering if you have anything to say about the distinction between outputs and impact, or maybe this is not the stage to do that.
You mean outcomes and impact?
I'm sorry, outcomes and impact.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I do. In that there is a difference. I don't think it's anywhere near as important as the difference between outputs and outcomes. But the way I think of outcomes and impacts as outcomes are very closely tied to the intervention. So it's if you are seeking to improve mother's knowledge of child development, then that's an outcome. Your long-term goal, the impact, is that the children who are involved in this will have, will graduate from high school, okay? That they, down the line, they will be more stable, more, have higher quality of life, etc. Those are the long-term impacts. So impacts tend to be longer term, 3 to 5 years after the program. Outcomes are immediately after the program, during the program, if it's a longer program, maybe within a year or two, okay? Outcomes are also narrower because they are tied very closely to the program. A lot of things are going to affect whether children graduate from high school, right? Ultimately. One of them may be that their parents were more active and involved and knowledgeable about early childhood development and got their children into the appropriate services at an earlier time. But there's going to be a lot of other things that affect graduation from high school. Sometimes I have people ask me, well, should I even put those things down on paper? Our ultimate impact is, yeah, we do want children to graduate from high school, to get better jobs, to go to college. And we're doing all this in the first 3 years of life so that those long-term impacts happen. But hey, we don't want to be held responsible for that. And my answer to that is absolutely, because you do believe that what you're doing now is contributing to that. But again, it's a chain. It's a chain of events. And you are immediately affecting, hopefully, the outcomes, the earlier links in the chain. And that's where most outcome evaluations focus. It's the rare evaluation that follow, and it happens, okay, don't get me wrong, it happens, but it's the rare evaluation that follows children 20 years to see whether they graduate from high school, okay? Your chances are you're not gonna do that in an evaluation context. But you're not even gonna be held responsible for that in a programmatic sense. What you're going to be held responsible for is that parents understood child development better, okay? Or parents were able to reduce the number of triggers in their home, triggers for asthma, okay? Those would be outcomes that are shorter term, closely tied to the specific activities of your program. Will they lead to ultimately, children growing up and having better controlled asthma and better lives? Hopefully that's a long-term impact, but you're not going to be probably focusing on that in an evaluation or any kind of an accountability framework.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah, great. Thank you.
So this is just the little table I presented earlier, a little more elaborated. So it has the 5 columns, but then it also has the assumptions above it, because this is so that people don't forget that pulling out these assumptions, identifying them, making them explicit is part of this process. And then the measurements box at the bottom is just to say, like, this is where we're headed for evaluation. We're going to measure the outputs in a process evaluation. We're going to measure outcomes and possibly impacts in an outcome evaluation. Oh, I always forget this slide has a bunch of animation on. Okay, I just present this. This is, a little bit different framework. This is from the Kellogg Foundation website. So it's kind of a popular logic model figure, and it's very similar to the other one. It just pulls out outcomes impacts into 3 columns, sort of short term, medium term, and then longer term. And it has an additional column for participation. And this can be helpful to think about. And then it acknowledges that the program, the intervention, is not the only thing going, right? You also have external factors. Okay, you're talking about kids graduating from high school. Well, there's going to be all kind of other external factors, and you may factor them into evaluation. But even if you don't, it's always, I think, a good idea to remember that those exist. Okay. So now we're going to walk through together an example. And then I'm going to give you guys an example to work on a little bit. So this is a program that I think I mentioned earlier. This is an evaluation that I was involved in many, many years ago. Again, when homelessness among families was kind of an emerging issue. And the problem that was identified by the stakeholders who were interested in this was that even when families who made it through the shelter system, they waited on the queue for housing, finally got an apartment, they would get that apartment either through New York City Housing Authority, public housing, or they would get it through HPD, scattered site housing, but they would get an apartment and they would move into it. For some subset of families, that was necessary but insufficient to keep them housed. There was a percentage of families that were at elevated risk, and specifically elevated risk to fall back into the shelter system. And so this program was designed to zero in on that subset of families, those high-risk families, who needed more than just some permanent housing, okay, which is a huge thing to get, but needed more. And so the way that this particular program operated was that the funder was a New York City foundation, not the New York State Health Foundation. This was even before they existed. They funded 4 long-standing, well-respected social service agencies in New York City, in 4 different areas of the city, to work with these families. And the strategy was that they would provide what they called intensive case management to these high-risk families. So the first step was to identify the families, and for that, NYU researchers, in fact, had developed an algorithm based on some research that really was predictive of families repeating homelessness. So identify those families, then case managers would approach those high-risk families, and and it was a voluntary program, nobody was making anybody adopt this program. They would work with the families who agreed to be worked with for up to a year. And for those of you who know anything about case management, you will be startled to see that the case managers worked with the families, 4 families at a time. That was their caseload. So this was very intensive. And it involved some other things too. It involved sort of explicitly adopting a strength-based approach, trying to identify family strengths, working with them on that, partnering with the families, trying to break down the barrier between professional and client, make it more equal sort of relationship. It involved other aspects, but this was the basic idea. And the real driving thinking behind this approach was that what these families struggled with was really truly stabilizing. That they were, and I think this is probably still the case. At this time, it was very common for families, once they got to the top of the queue, on paper, they were to be offered 3 apartments that they could move into. But in reality, and we had this on pretty good authority, they were actually pretty much pressured into taking the first apartment that they were shown. And that apartment was more likely than not nowhere near where the family had lived before. And oftentimes, in a completely different building, which I'm sure many of you know, for a lot of low-income folks who grew up in Brooklyn, for example, the Bronx is another country. And so being plunked down into the Bronx with no social network, no family, no familiarity, is tough. And so the thinking here was that these case managers would really help stabilize these families by helping them to get familiar with their neighborhoods, helping them to figure out where their kids should go to school, how they needed to be enrolled, where to go shopping, what the bus and subway routes were, etc. Like really help them become comfortable in the neighborhood. And that is really the term they use. We're trying to help families become comfortable, and then that comfort will lead to them staying, to it sticking, to the housing sticking, if it will. And so the goal here was stable housing, not falling back into the shelter system, reducing recidivism in that case. Okay, so that's sort of the program in a nutshell. So I'm going to ask you, let's fill in mentally here the columns of our logic model. So what resources do you imagine that they had or would need for this program? This is a brand new program for the agency, but they were longstanding existing neighborhoods with a very high, I would say, trust profile within their catchment areas. Thoughts on what resources they would need to have?
You're asking resources in general for implementing the program, the
Yes.
intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So staff, right?
So staff. So yeah. They all had existing experienced staff. Mm-hmm.
They would have to have housing agencies that they're working with. I don't know if that's
well, that was a given, but that's a good point. I mean, it's true that a resource, the agencies didn't have to draw on it, but the program did. The housing was a resource. You're absolutely right.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't have to find the housing. The city, got them the housing, right. Okay. But the housing had to exist for this program to even get going. Yep. And they all had a grant. Okay, and it was a generous grant. They had a very substantial grant from the foundation that was funding this. So they had money, they had expertise, they had housing, they had reputation and connections in their communities. They knew stuff, they were very familiar as agencies with the areas. So those are some of the resources. Now let's kind of think through, what are the activities? So if we go back to the beginning, we need case managers. So they either had to identify case managers with time available within their agencies, or they had to find and hire new case managers to work on this program. So that was kind of an early step. They had to somehow get case managers into the role. And these case managers were to be fully funded and devoted to this program. Okay, what else did they have to do?
Research on the individual families first.
Yeah, so they had to apply this algorithm. And I should say that the existing algorithm was a resource. We already had the algorithm that would identify high-risk families, but they had to apply it and identify those high-risk families. And so then what?
Well, after identifying the families, they would have to research, what's their job, what's their name, what's their address, how do I contact them, how do I get the interview, and all of that. So the logistics of the interview itself.
Yeah. So
And
then they would have to,
preparing the set of questions that would be customized for that particular family.
So they had to identify the families, they had to recruit the families, and they had to engage the families. This is a volunteer program. So they, in some sense, had to sell the program a little bit to the families. Now, once they have the families, all the activities, they had to meet with the families. This was a very home-based program. They had to visit the families. They accompanied the families around their new neighborhoods. These were all sort of the activities. They had to identify appropriate services for the families. If the families needed educational services, if they needed mental health services, substance services, etc. They needed to do all of that. So they needed to establish a rapport with the families. They needed to link them to appropriate services and follow them. So these are the main activities. So thinking of those activities, here's a test. What are the outputs? How are we going to assess whether, if we were tasked with assessing the implementation of the program, what would we want to look at? What would appear in the output column?
Well, an evaluation of the success, either, housing stability over time, right? Is it successful? Have those particular families, in fact, stayed in their neighborhoods longer, in their homes longer, right?
Well, I'm going to stop you there because that's an outcome, what you're talking about.
Okay.
You are now jumped over to, did this program work? Is this program effective? And you're absolutely right that a very important outcome for this program was that they remain housed. And so from an evaluation perspective, we decided, for various logistical reasons as well, that we would look at whether they were still housed 1 year later. Okay, so that was an outcome. What about outputs, though? So, thinking about that
would be the number of visits, the length of the visit, the type of visit, that sort of thing.
And stepping back before that, okay, because we pulled out various activities, it would be things like, well, each agency needs 4 case managers to manage their caseload. How many case managers do they have? Okay. They needed training in the model. What was the attendance at the training? What percentage of the case managers finished the training, et cetera. Okay. In terms of identifying the families, the number of families that were identified as moving into their catchment area, the number and percentage of those that were identified as being high risk, the number of those high risk families who were approached, the number of those that were engaged, the number of those that stayed in the program for a year. Then when we get to the things that they did with them, how many home visits did they make? How many places did they visit in the neighborhood? Okay, these would all be outputs. Okay. Now let's move over to the outcomes. So a very important outcome was remaining housed. But what was supposed to lead to that? What about this was supposed to happen to make these high-risk families that were at risk, objectively at risk for not staying housed? What was an outcome that was supposed to be the magic bullet here?
Better connection to the neighbors and neighborhood.
Yeah. So something around connection and familiarity and comfort in the neighborhood. That was really the underlying theory here. And it was an assumption that doing these activities, would lead to that. Okay. And then ultimately, what would impacts be? What were we hoping ultimately for these families and their neighborhoods even?
Greater stability.
Greater stability, greater quality of life, less disruption and chaos for the children and the families, better outcomes for the children long-term. So all of those things we would kind of put in that impact column. Things that were far down the line, probably we're not going to evaluate them in a reasonable time frame for an evaluation, but that's where we're headed. That's the goal, is that these families have better lives. Okay, but the outcomes that we can look at are that they feel more stabilized, less chaotic, comfortable in their neighborhoods, and that at least a year later, they're still there. Okay, they're still housed.
I have a question. What about a wild card that really would vary from family to family, which has to do with the ability to retain a paying job, which really deeply
and those would be
homelessness, right?
Right, those would be these kind of external factors that are important to keep in mind. And we may try to evaluate them. Leaping ahead to evaluation, the way we would control for that is we have a comparison group. I had a comparison group of families that are moving into the same sort of circumstances, are similarly at high risk, but they don't get the program. Right. And so those external factors are at play with them, but they don't have the program. And so looking at the difference, which is exactly how we did evaluate it. Now let's talk for a minute about the assumptions. Okay, so let's focus on the process side first. The assumptions that would that had to be there for this program to even operate. And I'm going to ask somebody other than Matt to see somebody else can see if somebody else can contribute. What assumptions were they making?
I've already contributed, but maybe I'll just jump in for a second just to say one assumption is that the families themselves would be interested in having a long-term stable housing situation.
Absolutely, or even before that, they're interested in working with some strange case manager.
Right.
Okay, and that's an interesting assumption. Just to give you a little more background on this program, the program model for this program was adopted from a very different problem. The original intensive case management model that they were using was developed and implemented with families who were at imminent risk of losing their child into foster care. And it was considered sort of a crisis intervention model. The family is faced with, my kid is going to be taken away. And here's a possible person who will work with me to help me get the situation under control enough that I will not lose my child. They took that model and popped it over to this problem of recidivism among homeless families. And I would say that this was an assumption that was very, very problematic, because what we found out is that for these families, unlike the families who are about to lose a child to foster care, these families did not feel in crisis at all. They felt exactly the opposite. They felt like they just hit the jackpot because they got an apartment. These were families that had been in the shelter often for up to a year. And suddenly it was their turn and they got an apartment. And here you have somebody coming in and saying, we know this is a hard time for you and we want to, work with you and help you out. And a lot of the families were like, this is no hard time for me. We got an apartment. So that assumption that this situation was analogous to the prior situation, and of course you didn't know all that background, but that was an assumption they made. And it wasn't true. A lot of families were not that interested in this. Okay. Another assumption that they made, originally, at least one of the agencies said they wanted to hire as case managers master's trained folks. So MSWs, they were primarily thinking. And that proved to be entirely impossible. No master's trained individual was interested in doing this job for the pay that they were offering. So that was an assumption that they made that, oh yeah, we can hire master's prepared people and they'll do this work, and they had to change it. That assumption was not true and they had to change it. Other assumptions? Another assumption is that this algorithm really works. right? That it really does identify people who are at high risk, so that we're identifying and working with indeed a high risk population. So how about, go ahead.
Oh, another assumption could be that the staff that they hire has the right cultural competency or personality or skill set to really connect with the families.
Yes, and interesting you should say that, because one of the supposed hallmarks of this program was that the people, the case managers would adopt this sort of different, this partnership approach. And they would really, the families and the case managers were working together. They were sort of in it together. And I actually accompanied some of them as part of the process evaluation to see how this was looking in real time. And sometimes these case managers, they would get into the home and they would pull out their clipboard and they would say, okay, Ms. So-and-so, last time that we met, you said you were going to do X, Y, and Z. Tell me, how well you've done those tasks. And I thought, well, this isn't really like the partnership, strength-based model that they were supposedly trained and utilizing. So again, an assumption that the case managers could do that they could kind of change their mindset and do that. And for some, that was an assumption that was not true. Great. So what about on the why side? Why is this supposed to work? What are they assuming? Okay, Meta, I'll let you speak.
Well, I think I said this before. There's an assumption that a connection to the neighborhood and a familiarity with a neighborhood will actually result in a greater incentive to remain within the neighborhood.
Absolutely. I mean, that was a very key assumption on the impact side. And then the assumption prior to that is that by working with the families in this way, they would feel more comfortable. Right. That this approach, this strength-based, we're kind of friends working on this together approach, would indeed make them feel more comfortable in the neighborhood. So those were sort of key outcome sort of assumptions. And just to kind of,
I have a question. Were they actually introduced to other neighbors so that they could actually form personal connections as well?
They could do that.
Or was it just like walking them through and showing them where the shopping is and so forth?
They had a lot of freedom, they being the case managers, to kind of approach it as they wish. So they could do that. My recollection is that was kind of rare. It was much more focused on kind of concrete, nuts and bolts sorts of things. Like, let's go to the grocery store together. Let's go to the subway stop and see where it goes, that kind of thing. It was more narrowly focused. And so just to give you, the punchline on this, so we did do an outcome evaluation, and what we found is that it didn't work. The program families were no more likely to be housed 1 year later than the families in the comparison group. Now, interestingly, we did test one of these outcome assumptions, and that was the link between feeling comfortable and staying housed. And what we found was that actually was true, that the families who did recidivate, did go back to the shelter system within a year, they did report lower levels of comfort. But that was true among the program families and among the comparison families. And so what we concluded is the program didn't really do anything to make them feel more comfortable. Okay, feeling comfortable did matter, that was true, but the program activities or the approach the program took didn't change that level of comfort, or didn't make a difference between the two groups of families. Okay, and then here's just a fairly simple diagram of what we have talked about. Okay, So now what we're going to do, and we don't have a lot of time, but we're still going to do it. I'm going to break you into a couple of groups. Let me see how many people are here. And you're going to do this little exercise as a group, okay, with a new example. And then we'll come back and share some thoughts about it. So this is an example. This is another evaluation that we really did. Part of, and some of you may be familiar with the Bronx Reach initiative. This is a long-standing initiative backed by the Institute for Family Health, which is a collection of FQHCs and lookalikes, mostly in the Bronx, although they have some clinics elsewhere as well. But they got money years ago, first from the CDC, then from NIH, and back to the CDC, to launch an initiative whose main goal was to reduce diabetes prevalence, morbidity, or mortality in the South Bronx specifically. And this was in response to a particular call from the Centers for Disease Control. The way they approached this, and this mechanism, I would say, was prescribed by the funder, by the CDC, is that they had to form a coalition of community partners. And the community partners were very broadly defined. They could be people from the health department, they could be people from the education sector, they could be small business owners, they could be parents, they could be residents, but various community partners were brought together to figure out, well, what can we do about this diabetes problem? And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the fact that the South Bronx is like the diabetes capital of the known world. Terribly high rates of prevalence, but also morbidity and mortality from diabetes. So this made sense. And of course, the idea was that by the community partners coming together, they would come up with a good approach that would work in their neighborhood. What they came up with was a faith-based initiative. And this was first started, I'm going to say, in the early 2000s, when, and in fact, it was originally called Bronx Reach 2010, I believe. So the goal was 2010. And what they decided was faith-based communities were very important in this community, and that would be a good way to go. And at the time, faith-based initiatives were kind of new. Now, everybody and their brother has a faith-based initiative, but at the time, this was sort of cutting edge to have a faith-based initiative. And it really became a three-pronged approach. They would get churches that were interested in participating. Participation meant that every church that participated would identify somebody within their church to be a diabetes coordinator. In some churches, this was a paid staff member. Some churches had a parish nurse, and that was the individual identified. In other churches, it was a volunteer. It was a lay person from the congregation. The diabetes coordinators were trained as a group on two things. One, about diabetes, of course, how to prevent it, how to know it, how to manage it if you have it, all that kind of thing. But also they were trained on how to get things going, how to set up groups, activities, and workshops. And they were, for this project, they compiled a big binder of resources, community resources on how to be a leader like this. And the group of coordinators met and were trained, and then went back to their churches to implement things like fitness clubs, cooking classes, workshops about managing diabetes, etc. A second prong was that the clergy, the priest or the pastor or minister of the church, and these were all Christian churches, by the way, it didn't set out to be that way, but it was. The clergy would agree that they would preach a certain number of sermons or homilies a year that were related to physical well-being. And there were a couple of very high-profile clergy members who were part of the coalition, and they actually developed kind of sample sermons for these clergy to use. And then finally, the third thing was to try and change the culture, the norms within these churches around food. And this tended to focus on putting in place some guidelines for like church suppers so that they would be less, more diabetes friendly, shall we say. So this was the idea. This was the program. So what I'm going to do is break you into just two groups, I think. And I want you to spend 15 minutes kind of thinking about, the logic model. And I think you were sent a template that you can use to jot it down. Kayla is also going to put it in the chat, the file, so you can download it. But just sort of, quickly sketch out the logic model based on this amount of information. And then also, if you have time, think about at least one process assumption and one outcome assumption. And then we'll come back and take maybe 5 minutes to sort of share. But before we do that, are there any questions about any of this? Okay. Okay, so where's my breakout thing? I'm gonna. Okay, I'm having trouble pulling up my bottom menu. Can you do it?
Let me try. Breakout room.
Oh, wait a minute, here we go.
You found it?
Yeah, but I'm not seeing breakout rooms on I had it before.
Here, let me see if I can try now.
Oh, there, I got it. Okay, you will have to join. Once I hit this button, join your group. And I'll pop in and see how you're doing.
Okay, I think that worked.
Yep.
Hey.
Okay. Yeah, we don't have much time now. See what they come up with. Okay. Close. Woo.
Uh-oh, I gotta charge my laptop. I need to get that.
Got a what?
Gotta get my laptop charger. It's gonna die. Oops.
So how you doing, Kayla?
I'm good. You know.
We might be being recorded. This is one thing I don't know if when they go on, I know the breakout rooms are not recorded, but I don't know if the recording's still.
That's a good question. I would think that this, like the main space, is probably still recorded if the breakout rooms aren't. Yeah, for some reason I can only, I think it's because I made you a co-host. I think you have to be like the host, the main host, in order to.
Because earlier I did have.
Yeah.
Breakout thing, but then when I looked, it wasn't there.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I guess there can only be one like full host. Yeah.
Just coincidentally, this week's class that I'm teaching is also the logic model class. So I'm going to basically be doing this again on Thursday.
Wow, you probably have this memorized.
Yeah.
Did you time the breakout groups?
Well, we only had, it's already 3:18.
Yeah.
It's supposed to end at 3:30. So they're not going to be able to get very far. I'll just give them, 5 more minutes.
Are you able to put, like, you're able to put a timer on them though, right? Like a breakout room?
I can end it.
Oh, I see. Okay. Huh. Yeah, I should really familiarize myself with that feature. Ah. Can you see the logic model template in the chat? Apparently, I guess when they go to breakout rooms, the chat gets erased. I can just email it to her.
Oh, did somebody ask about it?
Yeah, I'll just send it again.
I actually don't see the chat. Why is that? Okay, I'm going to pull them back. Now I can see the chat.
Huh, weird. Where are they?
Yeah, they should be. Because they're hanging on to the last second. My students come popping back right away when I post. Okay, I know that was short, but we only have a few minutes left, but just curious quickly, so what did you come up with? Group one. Pick a column, pick an assumption.
We should share a screen.
Okay. I
Uh,
don't, can we have her do that?
It
Lucy?
should work.
Lucy?
Sorry. I'm unable to right now. Let me try. It says that it's disabled.
Mm.
It's probably in the settings, which
Can the host enable her? Just enable sharing of multiple participants would be the way to do it. Go to the green button.
no, it's not an option.
Risa, I think you're on mute. Sorry. I just wanted to send my apologies. I have to jump off for another meeting, but I wanted to thank you all so much. My
Sure.
group and Carolyn and Kayla, thanks a lot.
Okay,
Really incredibly informative.
And
Thanks.
don't forget, we're available for individual technical assistance. So if you ever need us just for help with your own project, reach out.
Well, it was fantastic today. Thanks to you and Liz and everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.
Okay, try sharing again, Lucy. See if it works.
Oh, yep, this should work.
Okay.
Okay, so we kind of just jotted it down quickly, but this is what we have. So for resources, things like just, creating a logic model to begin with, what their assumptions are of the outputs of their activities, gathering coordinators, congregation coordinators, nurses, leaders, laymen, etc. The actual written and educational materials, sample sermons, the event planning, like the classes, the church suppers, etc. And then program funding, everything from paying the coordinators to costs of dinners, of cleanup, binders, everything, etc. under the sun.
I would say that some of those things I might put in the activities column, but I think I can see why you put in the resources column, and I don't think that's critical.
Mm-hmm. And then, in activities, we have like the creation of these things. So creating the binders, doing the research, and then the trainings, logistics planning. You need to have systems for knowing who's participating, who's keeping up with the program, etc. Gathering information just as to what the substance of these sermons should be, adapting them, and then putting on these church suppers. So like, creating invitations, preparing for it, having it actually, and then cleaning it up.
And I'll ask group two, did you have any other activities? I mean, one activity that is really important here is they had to recruit the churches. Okay, so that was the very first activity, is to recruit the churches. Then the churches had to identify the diabetes educators. And then we get to some of these, the trainings and setting up the guidelines, et cetera.
Yeah.
And every activity needs to have at least one output, right? So if you have creating binders, then you want to have an output. It's that, the binder has 552 pages, if it's recruiting churches, what's the output?
Right.
Number of churches recruited. Okay, so these are all indicators that the activities have happened, and a step further, happens successfully. Okay. Outcomes, before, better control of diabetes is definitely an outcome. What comes before that?
We had, and listener, let me know if I'm misremembering, but outcomes is like healthier eating. And one of our activities was also like surveys, so we can track participant behavior, and then also track like who were the people who were interested in these activities and showed up, because it's probably not the whole congregation.
Attendance and who they are, those would all be outputs. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then outcomes, better eating, probably something about better physical activity, right?
Yeah.
But before that, what's supposed to lead to that? What about this program is going to lead to that, at least in part?
The recruitment?
Well, that's an activity, and the output for that would be the number of churches. But what's supposed to change in the congregants? Well, they're supposed to be better informed, right? They're supposed to know what they need to eat and what they don't need to eat. They're supposed to know how much exercise, okay? And then that would lead to better eating, better management of diabetes if you already have it, better controlled diabetes, okay? Because it would lead to behavior change, and then behavior change would lead to your A1Cs coming down, let's say, okay? And then impacts, really, what's the big impact here? What was their big goal? Reduce morbidity and mortality and prevalence in the Bronx. Like that was their big impact. And of course, this is just one stream of outcomes that would get us there. Yeah, good. Okay, how about let's just do one assumption on each side. What's a process assumption?
I mean, one that sort of jumps out to me is that sort of that diabetes is only linked to the way that people think about eating and not necessarily like affordability of fresh food in the Bronx, like, or like
and
the
so that's actually, that's an impact assumption. Okay. You're right. It's an impact assumption because it affects the why. Mm-hmm. So you're right. The assumption here is that knowledge is, you know, enough to change behavior, but maybe it's also how much money you have. Okay. The program's not doing anything about that.
Right.
Right. So the assumption is that by changing the knowledge, that's enough to change these behaviors, when you're right, other factors may come into play. Mm-hmm.
Another set of assumptions is that peer pressure, in other words, bringing people into a group where they're all sort of eating better and learning better, helps, you know, people absorb it better and potentially implement it. Mm-hmm. Another is that leaders actually have a greater influence on peers. In other words, the idea of an example actually has a great impact.
Right, you're right about all of those. Those are all impact assumptions.
Right.
Before we go, I need one process assumption. Just one.
What could you define again what you mean by process
assumptions that are being made that this program can even be implemented? So one of them is churches will agree. Churches will sign up for this. They had to sign up for this. This is outside of the bailiwick of most churches, right? They had to agree, okay? And they had to be able to identify a diabetes educator. You know, if they had a paid nurse, all right, that makes sense. But if you just need a volunteer, you know, who knows? So anyway, we have to stop there. You guys are great. And if you do have any other questions or comments, I'll stay on for a few minutes, but I do want to just, you know, formally let you go. And again, I've already worked with Lucy and Marielle, they know this, but we are available to work with you individually as well. If you have questions about evaluating your New York State health funded, you know, initiatives, please feel free to contact us. Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you. It's very, very helpful.
Oh, great. Glad to hear it.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Ms. Perry. So quick question. Mm-hmm. Always apply this process to any module that we're trying to accomplish, right? Like it's always safe to, and because I'm learning, you know, this is new. You remember me from goals?
from
Goals with Marielle and Lucy. I was on
Oh, okay, you were there too. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't remember.
No,
Yeah.
no problem. I'm learning, and so like, I'm the executive assistant, and she's always she's like, you always assume, and you go to these big roles without the little. So with this garden in the box, you've taught me like it's all the little things, and I'm just like, I didn't even think this project was going to be
Well,
so.
people don't. I mean, you are not alone or unique in that at all. I mean, that's why this is valuable, because it makes you think about things that you just take for granted.
It's true, and I've become so appreciative of the little things, even the pamphlets that I see. I'm like, that took a lot for people to. So I'm just, that was just my question, that I should always input this chart into any.
Well, obviously, you may not have time to do this for every single intervention that you have going, right? But even just taking an hour to say, what are we trying to do here? And why do we think this is going to have a hope of success? So using your, the garden in a box, like there's a lot of assumptions there. There's assumptions that people want to raise herbs in their house, okay? There's an assumption that even if I do want to do that, that's going to somehow inspire me to change my eating behavior. I mean, that's quite a leap, okay? But that's an assumption that particular intervention has. And it's a good idea to say, okay, is that enough? Or do we need to maybe tie that together more? It just can help you say, oh, maybe we need a little bit more here or a little bit here. Yeah.
Well, thank you. You're always so well informed.
Great. Well, it's nice to see you.
It was nice to see you again. I'll be seeing you probably again.
Okay, yeah, love it. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.